أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yesterday we discussed the teaching of the Quran with respect to fasting and how the introduction of fasting was meant to prepare us and make it more easy and accessible for us to undertake this act of worship. When we want to undertake fasting, then there are two ways that we can approach fulfilling this divine obligation. And this goes for fasting and for any other act of worship or any other obligation that we might have, a religious obligation or even an obligation that we have to our family or anywhere else within society. One is that we can think that it is a duty, we have to do it, we don't have any other choice, and so we will do it, but we won't do so willingly. We certainly will not be able to say that if I weren't being watched, if I weren't going to be evaluated, if there were no one to punish me, I would still do it. What Islam wants us to maintain is the spirit of voluntary actions even when we are fulfilling our obligations. So part of preparing us for fasting is to make us appreciate the value of that spirit of doing things with a voluntary intention. And the Quran, in the verse that I recited yesterday in verse number 184 of Surah Al-Baqarah, it indicates this reality. Once again, the verse is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. After introducing fasting, Kutiba alaykum as-siyamu kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, in the previous verse. Then in verse 184 we read that فَمَنْ تَطَوَّعَ خَيْرًا فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَهُ وَأَنْ تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. So as I mentioned yesterday, there are some who have said that this indicates that these verses were revealed when fasting was not yet a single obligation. People might have had a choice to either fast or not to fast. And the verse is saying that مَنْ تَطَوَّعَ خَيْرًا فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَهُ وَأَنْ تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. That if you do something that is good voluntarily, that's good for you. If you go above and beyond the call of duty. And if you fast, that is also good for you. But if we look at this verse, as we mentioned yesterday, as part of a interconnected series of verses and not something which is disjoint, not something which was revealed at a separate time from the verse before it and the verse after it, then this part of the verse might not be referring to something that is voluntary as opposed to something that is an obligation. But it might be saying to us that when you have an obligation, you still have the choice of doing it with the spirit of wanting to do so. You still have the choice of asking Allah to give you the ability to go above and beyond the call of duty. If we are told, for example, that Zakatul Fitrah is equivalent to a certain amount, which we give in zakat after the month of Ramadan, there is no requirement that we give the minimum amount of fitrah as our zakat. We can always go above and beyond the call of duty. for those who are elderly and are unable to fast for sickness. As the verse mentions and as we read in books of fiqh, you can give a fidya, a compensation for not being able to fast. And that is sufficient to feed one person to their full, to give a mud of food. A mud is a measurement which is approximately 1.5 pounds of food. So 1.5 pounds or 750 grams. So it's possible to do that, but it's also good to give more. The obligation is there. But if we have the spirit of doing so voluntarily, what it means that we will do it, first of all, willingly, and second of all, that we will try to see how we can go above and beyond the call of duty in order to show Allah that it is not simply because of the threat of punishment that we are interested in fulfilling our obligations, but because by giving us those obligations, Allah has told us what it is that is pleasing to Him. He has told us what it is that is good for our bodies and good for our souls. So with that, we can take this verse to say that fasting, even if it is an obligation, even if it is a requirement in the month of Ramadan, there is also a value to do so mutatawwi'an, to do so with a voluntary spirit. وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. And fasting is one of those acts of goodness. So the verse first sets a general principle. مَن تَطَوَّعَ خَيْرًا فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَهُ. A person who voluntarily does good, any good, whether it be prayer, whether it be fasting, whether it be an act of kindness or charity to a fellow human being, whatever act of goodness the person does with that spirit of voluntariness, with that spirit of willingness, that is better than to do so kicking and screaming, to do so as a sense of obligation. And fasting is better than the alternative. It has benefits. So today I want to move beyond the discussion of our wajib fast and look at the role that fasting can play within our advancement and our development, even above and beyond that minimum obligation that we have in the month of Ramadan. Let me begin by saying that we should not feel that the wajib fasting is anything that is deficient. We shouldn't put down our wajibat and not recognize their value and think that our blessings, our salvation, it comes from that which is mustahab. There is a reason why Allah has said that certain things are fard and certain things are sunnah or fadl. A fard is an obligation, and fadl is that which is virtue, that which is extra. If something is essential to our spiritual development, if it is essential to our salvation, then Allah will have made it into an obligation. He will have made it one of the fara'id, and He will have clearly given us the instruction and the obligation to perform it. So when we speak about recommended acts, we shouldn't think that, well, the obligations are simply to establish a baseline. And sometimes that is the case, where people will not give importance to their 5 daily prayers because they think that that is something that is par for the course. Everyone does it, everyone has to do it, but you only acquire virtue and you only acquire a higher spiritual rank by what you do beyond it. That fasting in the month of Ramadan is something which is just a minimum requirement, and it is what you do above that and beyond that that is going to give you a higher spiritual rank. There is a hadith of the Prophet in which he speaks about the month of Ramadan in particular. I want to read and translate this hadith, and after quoting this hadith, we will move on to the acts of fasting beyond the obligation. So this is the hadith of our Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. He says that man sama shahra Ramadan imanan wa ihtisaban. A person who fasts in the month of Ramadan with faith and seeking reward only from Allah, not for any other purpose. Ihtisab, that the ajr we seek, the reward we seek is only with Allah. Wa kaffa sam'ahu wa basarahu wa lisanahu 'anil nas. And a person who is able to control his tongue and his eyes and his ears from harming any other person. If a person fasts with the minimum obligation, and then in addition, the remainder of their organs also participate in that fast. So my tongue, in addition to not consuming food through my mouth, I'm also making sure that I'm not saying anything which would be hurtful or damaging or offensive to another person. If I do these things and a person fulfills that obligation, the Prophet says, غَفَرَ لَهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ وَمَا تَأَخَّرَ. Allah will forgive their old sins and their newer sins. وَأَعْطَاهُ ثَوَابَ الصَّابِرِينَ. And Allah will give them that rank which has been mentioned in the Quran for the sabirin, which is a guarantee of paradise. So giving importance to our obligation, realizing that the month of Ramadan is not just the baseline that we have to check that and then we can get on to things that are actually going to be meaningful. No, even in the month of Ramadan, not just fast, but we also want to make sure that our entire body, all of our organs, they should participate within that fast. There is a hadith of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that لا يكون يوم صومك كيوم فطرك. That your day of fasting should not be like your day of when you are not fasting, your day of eating and drinking normally. Not just in terms of your food and drink, but in terms of making sure that you don't respond to provocation, that you don't let your impulses get the better of you in what you say and what you do and where you go, and all of the other minor decisions that we have within life. If we give value to our fast in the month of Ramadan, then that is something which is sufficient for a person to have that divine guarantee of paradise, having their sins forgiven, and being counted among the sabirin. But as we said, even within that month of Ramadan, the spirit that Allah wants us to preserve is the spirit of tatawwu'. And we have been told in numerous ahadith that sabr, when it is referred to in Islamic discourse and in the Quran, it refers, yes, in general to forbearance, right? To making sure that we have forbearance, that we have the willpower to carry through on our obligations. As-sabru ala ta'a, to be patient in doing what Allah has ordered us to do. As-sabru anil ma'asiyah, to be patient and have forbearance in avoiding those things that Allah has forbidden us. As-sabru ala al-musibah, to have patience over hardship and tribulation. So sabr has a general meaning, and then it has a more specific meaning. And that more specific meaning is fasting. That is one of the extensions, one of the meanings and the examples of sabr that is specifically intended in the Quran. So once we make sure that we are fulfilling our obligation and that we are giving due weight and attention to our obligation, the way that we can indicate our voluntary spirit is by also thinking about how it is that we can fast outside of the month of Ramadan. And how is it that this should fit into our plans for our spiritual health and well-being, our regimen, so to speak, our diet, spiritually speaking, for our well-being throughout the rest of the year. So the importance of the month of Ramadan, the importance of the fard, the obligation, is there. And then building on that, without detracting from it, we want to also move beyond it. Now here, this is one of those areas where the fact that other religions had a concept of fasting, they had a concept of abstinence from this world, they had a concept, for example, of vows of silence, they had a concept of a vow of poverty, they had a concept of making a pledge to avoid certain foods, perhaps avoid eating meat, perhaps avoid eating certain types of food. The fact that people had this background influenced their expectations and their goals once they became Muslim as well. Even in the time of the Prophet, there were some people who used to fast every single day. There were some people who used to fast almost every day. And so what is it that as a Muslim we should consider to be the ideal? What is it that we should strive for, and how is it that we should approach fasting? There is a general principle which has been mentioned in numerous ahadith, that in order to complete the faridah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated twice as much as the obligation as a recommendation for a person to do, to go above and beyond the call of duty. That does take place for prayer. We have 17 cycles, 17 raka'at, which are obligatory in our prayer. And then the nawafil, the recommended prayers, if a person wishes to do all of them, the nawafil associated with each of the 5 daily prayers, and the nafilah of the night, that totals 34 cycles, 34 raka'at, which is twice as much as the obligation. 17 plus 17 is 34. So that is to complete the faridah. We have a similar type of thing for fasting. We are required to fast the month of Ramadan, which can be 29 days or it can be 30 days. And the Quran specifies that it's not just the month, but it is the completion of those days, which is part of the obligation of fasting. وَلِتُكْمِلُوا الْعِدَّةَ. To complete that obligation, that is part of the goal of fasting. That is also perhaps a little bit of a hint to us why it is that those who miss prayer for a valid reason, for example, a woman who has given birth and is in nifas, she will miss prayer for some days or in other circumstances. Those prayers do not need to be made up, because those prayers are for a particular time, and if a person did not have the obligation at that time, there is no general legislation in the Quran that you have to have completed 5 daily prayers even in those days when you are not able to pray. But with the obligation of fasting, وَلِتُكْمِلُوا الْعِدَّةَ is mentioned in the Quran, to complete that number. So if a person, even if they have a valid reason for not fasting, because, for example, of the days after childbirth or one of the other reasons, then it should be made up afterwards. The qada should be performed. So that is in accordance with the teaching of the Quran. With fasting, the recommendation goes beyond the obligation. We will see that it is recommended to fast the month of Sha'ban in particular. That is 1 month. And then there are 10 other months in the year outside of Ramadan and Sha'ban. Those 10 months, it is recommended to fast 3 days out of every month. And we will talk in a little bit of depth about the best way to do that. So 10 times 3 is 30, that is about 1 month. The month of Sha'ban, for example, would be 30 days. So that would total 60 days, and that would complete twice the amount of fasting for the faridah as a nafilah. But it's not required that a person does that. The sunnah about fasting is very simple according to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. There were some others in the Muslim community who had different opinions about what the sunnah in fasting is, and we will talk a little bit about that as well. But I'd like to begin by looking at verse number 35 of Surah Al-Ahzab. Surah Ahzab is Surah 33. This is verse 35. And in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, إِنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَالْقَانِتِينَ وَالْقَانِتَاتِ وَالصَّادِقِينَ وَالصَّادِقَاتِ وَالصَّابِرِينَ وَالصَّابِرَاتِ والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما. This is a very beautiful verse of the Quran. I'm sure all of you have heard it before. It is one that we should read periodically and remind ourselves of. It is a comprehensive verse in which Allah describes the attributes of a believer and those who have been guaranteed the reward of paradise. Allah has given them maghfirah wa ajran azima, forgiveness and a great reward that is guaranteed. It is narrated that the background to this verse, which I will translate in just a moment, is that when the migrants who had gone from Mecca and migrated to Ethiopia, to Abyssinia, when they returned to Medina, they had a great deal of perhaps a sense of sadness that they had missed so much of the Prophet's revelation. And for several years they had been absent. And yes, of course, they must have felt some kind of longing for their homelands, for their friends, nostalgia for their background. But the longing that they had more than anything else was that they were far from the Prophet. They only knew those surahs and those verses which they might have learned in Mecca before they made the migration, or perhaps if there were a message that were exchanged, they might get indirectly some message of the Prophet's teachings. When they returned to Medina, one thing they wanted to find out is what are the rest of the verses of the Quran that we have not heard until now. So one of those very noble muhajirat who did the hijrah from Mecca to Abyssinia and who was also a muhajirah who came to Medina was Asma bint Umays. She was, in a sense, a member of the household of the Prophet and very close to the Prophet and his progeny. She was married to Ja'far al-Tayyar, the brother of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Later on, she was also married to Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, and she had a role in taking care of the household of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam. She was the mother of Abdullah ibn Ja'far, who was the husband of Lady Zainab. So somebody who was very close to Ahlul Bayt throughout her life. Very close to Lady Fatima salamullahi alayha during her lifetime. Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The incident that is narrated is that when she came from Abyssinia to Medina, she went to the women folk of the Prophet's household. She went to the wives of the Prophet. And she said that, has anything been revealed about us in particular, about women in particular? And they said no. Now, that answer is not entirely accurate because in the Quran, whenever there is a general address referring to the believers, the mu'mineen, or Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, then it incorporates men and women. It's not meant just to be for the men. But there wasn't a revelation which mentioned women explicitly in as much detail as this verse. So when she heard that answer no, she went immediately to the Prophet. She said, Ya Rasulullah, we are going to perdition. We will not be able to achieve salvation. The Prophet said, Ya Asma, why is that? Why are you suspecting that there is any barrier between women and achieving salvation? She said that the Quran does not mention us explicitly and directly. And then this verse was revealed. The verse says that verily the Muslim men and the Muslim women, I'm not going to translate Muslim, those who submit, and the mu'mineen and the mu'minat, the believing men and the believing women, wal-qanitina wal-qanitat. Qanit comes from the same root as the word qunut that we know of as the prayer we recite in dua. Qanata literally means to consistently perform an act of obedience. Not necessarily specifically prayer, but to have that constancy in obedience, that carefulness in fulfilling our duty to our master, that is known as qunut. And qunut in salat is also a symbol of our exclusive attention to Allah. So those who are constant in their obedience to Allah, was-sadiqina was-sadiqat, those who are true, meaning those who are careful to ensure that their actions correspond with their words, they're not hypocritical. Was-sabirina was-sabirat, those who are patient. Wal-khashi'ina wal-khashi'at, men who have humility and women who have humility. Wal-mutasaddiqina wal-mutasaddiqat, those who give their sadaqah, whether it be an obligation or whether it be what is recommended. Was-sa'imina was-sa'imat, men who fast and women who fast. Wal-hafidhina furujahum wal-hafidhat, those men who guard themselves in their private parts and those women who guard themselves. وَالذَّاكِرِينَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَالذَّاكِرَاتِ, those men who mention Allah frequently and those women who mention Allah frequently, they have been promised by Allah forgiveness and a great reward. So in this verse, Allah addressed the concern of Asma, and maybe many other women, that in a spiritual sense, the Quran does not see any difference between men and between women. There is, of course, a natural prejudice that society and many different cultures may have, and even us as individuals. We tend to look at those things which are in front of everybody as being more real. And those things which are behind the scenes, those things which are not always recognized by others, as almost not being there. So for example, in the success of a program like this, there might be somebody who is giving a speech. There might be somebody who is reciting a qasida. But then there are many people who might have worked longer and harder or equally hard behind the scenes in order to allow that program to come together. Everybody will recognize the people who are in front. But those who are behind the scenes, we might not recognize it. But in a spiritual sense, it's not as if Allah is also going to read the coverage in the newspaper or the email and find out who to give what reward to. In the eyes of Allah, whether something is done in front or whether it is done behind the scenes, it is the quality of the action, it is the intention that Allah will reward and He will recognize it. It doesn't need to be out in front. And so in this verse, Allah is affirming that principle. Society might not always be able to see the sadaqah and the sincerity and the sabr of a woman, especially if it usually shows up within the personal life and within the family life that she has. But in the eyes of Allah, even if it doesn't show up, it is just as significant and it is just as important as the worship and the devotion and the good deeds of the men. And this verse was meant to make that very explicit and very clear. Now, out of the attributes that are mentioned, these are not attributes which are limited to our acts of wajib devotion. Right? So when we speak of Muslimin and Mu'mineen, Muslimat and Mu'minat, and then the remaining attributes, they are bringing together those who do their obligations and then those who go beyond their obligations. To submit is something that is our obligation, and Allah has tasked us with it. To have faith in all that Allah has revealed to His Prophet, in all of its details, that is an obligation. But then qaniteen wal qanitat, it goes above and beyond that, those who are especially careful in making sure that throughout their lives they are obeying the commandment and fulfilling the wishes of their Creator. Sadiqina was sadiqat, who are careful about the truth of their speech and the correspondence between their speech and their actions. Khushu' is also something which is an ethical attribute. It's not just something which characterizes one act of worship, but it is that which is with us throughout our lives. And then in this context where Allah mentions mutasaddiqeen, mutasaddiqat, those who give sadaqah, those who are generous and give in the path of Allah, that also incorporates what is required and what is not required. One of the attributes that is mentioned, and the only one of our acts of worship which is mentioned directly out of the 5 acts of worship which I mentioned are the basis of Islam, 4 of which we are used to speaking of as the branches of religion. Salat is not mentioned explicitly in this verse. Zakat is not mentioned exclusively in this verse, although it does come under sadaqah, because zakat is one form of sadaqah. Hajj is not mentioned in this verse explicitly. Psalm is mentioned though. So one of those things which is mentioned is that a believing man and a believing woman, they give importance to Psalm. As-sa'imina was-sa'imat. And that includes, of course, our obligation, the fasts that we do in the month of Ramadan, and it also includes that fast that we do beyond the month of Ramadan. So what are the benefits of fasting outside of the month of Ramadan? There are numerous benefits that are mentioned in ahadith. I want to just look at 2 ahadith that mention two of the important benefits. One is that fasting is a source for the solving of our material problems and even poverty. A person came to our seventh Imam, Imam Musa Kadhim alayhi salatu wassalam. He said, "Shakawtu ilayhi dhiqa yadi." I complained to the Imam that I do not have enough money to meet my obligations. I am unable to meet my obligations. And the Imam replied, "Sum wa tasaddaq." Fast and give sadaqah. Whatever you do have, you might not be able to meet all of your obligations, so you might not be able to give as much as you would like in the path of Allah. But give some sadaqah. Make sure that you remember that because you are in a vulnerable position does not mean that you will shift your name from the giver's column to the taker's column. You are still going to be a giver. And that is not just a spiritual teaching, but it's an important psychological principle as well. This is something which, if any of us have ever been unemployed, and inshallah that is not something which we will have to go through, but one of the challenges that people face, if they have been unemployed for a while, if they have been rejected from a job, or if they faced failure even in applying to a school for education, is that you begin to internalize that you are not cut out for that kind of a triumph or that kind of a success. Right? So we might not dress as professionally, we might not speak as professionally, we might not groom ourselves in such a way that would give anybody the impression that we are qualified for what we are looking for. Now, it's not just a matter of that psychological push that Islam wants to give us, but this spiritual teaching is also in accordance with what we need psychologically. If we are in a weak position, if we feel that we have poverty, we're not able to meet our needs, then two things that Allah has taught us that can help us solve our problems are sum wa tasaddaq. First of all, you do have one resource. You might not be able to go for ziyarat because you can't afford it. You might not be able to do many of the other things that you would like to do. But fasting is something which, if anything, can reduce your expenses rather than increase them. And no matter how much we might be in difficulty, there is always the ability for us to do some kind of sadaqah, because sadaqah does not have to be given in a single form. It does not have to be given in a particular currency or a particular form of cash. Sadaqah means that we are giving in the way of Allah of what assets He has given us, whatever we might have at our disposal. So the Imam has said that this is one way that you can accomplish this need to restore yourself to prosperity. And then there are also a hadith that say that if there is any nazila, which means any kind of calamity, any kind of tribulation, any hardship which comes into your life, then the way to seek God's assistance and the way to overcome it, which is taught in the Quran, is through salat and sawm. That is the very best thing that a person can do to overcome any kind of difficulty or challenging situation. So here again, we don't need to go through all of our grandmother's old books of du'as to find the one dhikr that contains Ism A'zam in it, and then read a whole bunch of different kinds of du'as and try to find out what is that magic code. The Quran says that وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ. Seek the assistance of Allah through sabr and salat. Salat, we all know, it is our prayer, and anytime we have a need from Allah, we can make the intention of a 2 rak'ah prayer and salatul haja, and we can pray that and ask Allah for His assistance. Sabr means forbearance. But Allah is not telling us in the Quran, just be patient. If you need my help, wait, get in line, take a number and someday I'll get to you. The meaning of this verse that says, bis-sabri was-salat, is that you have an active means at your disposal to seek the assistance of Allah. It's not passive. Sabr is by training yourself to have forbearance through, as a hadith mentioned, fasting. And so there is a hadith which says that as-sabru huwa as-sawm. Sabr means fasting. That is both intimately connected to developing our sabr, and it is the means of accomplishing those goals that we might have in the course of our life, challenges and difficulties that we might face. Please recite salawat. So I want to move on to the discussion of what are the masnoon fasts, what are the recommended fasts, what was the sunnah of the Prophet. Before that, let me just mention two ahadith which give us a little bit of an added incentive and a motivation to fast. The first hadith is from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that لِلصَّائِمِ فَرْحَتَانِ فَرْحَةٌ عِنْدَ إِفْطَارِهِ وَفَرْحَةٌ عِنْدَ لِقَاءِ رَبِّهِ. That every person who fasts will have two pleasures that they will get as a result of fasting. One will be during the iftar, after having abstained from food for a length of time, then everything tastes good. Many of us may have experienced that. It's seldom the case that you will find an iftar that you are going to be hypercritical of because you have abstained from food. And that is a reality, that to appreciate things better, sometimes you need to have some kind of a distance. I won't mention any examples from within families or our relationships, but it is the case that if we abstain from material things for a while, then there is an added pleasure and an added enjoyment that we get from enjoying that. This is something which comes from Allah. It gives more meaning to our material things that we enjoy within this world. And it is a blessing that a believer has. It is one reason why a believer is able to deal with hardship more easily and more successfully than a non-believer. Because a believer is never going to lose the perspective of the value of even that simple date, of even that simple glass of water. Because even if they've spent a lifetime in comfort and in luxury and in ease, when the month of Ramadan comes or when the time for fasting comes, then they know what it means to enjoy the most simple of material pleasures. That is farhatun inda iftarihi. Allah has kept that happiness, that farha for the believer, and it is there for a very important purpose. It makes our material life more enjoyable as well as our spiritual life. But then there is something greater than that. وَفَرْحَةٌ عِنْدَ لِقَاءِ رَبِّهِ. That Allah is the host during the month of fasting. Allah is the one who has said that fasting is specifically associated with me. I mentioned part of this hadith yesterday, that every action that a believer does belongs to that believer. But fasting, Allah says that this belongs to me. So it is not so-and-so who fasted. But Allah says that this action, it is associated with me. That means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will keep a track of when we have fasted. And when we meet Him in the hereafter, then He will give us the recompense and the reward that He has postponed until that meeting. And so just as iftar is a small pleasure, it is a material pleasure, the Imam says that if you fast, there is a much greater pleasure that will come to you, and Allah will make sure that when you meet your Lord, you will get the reward of your fasting. It's not going to be delayed. You don't have to wait until all of your sins have been cleansed. But farhatun inda liqa'i rabbih. You meet your Lord, and Allah will have that reward and that pleasure waiting for you, and He will give it to you at that time. So that is one hadith, and the other hadith is also part of a general principle that we have, that لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ zakat وَزَكَاةُ الْأَجْسَادِ الصَّوْمِ. Everything has a zakat. Everything that we have been given by Allah, we need to make sure that we are taking care of it. Zakat, if you want to think of zakat in the sense that it's used in this verse, in this hadith and in other ahadith, think of it as when you go to a store, you buy something, they ask you, do you want the protection plan? And the protection plan is meant to give you some kind of guarantee, some kind of peace of mind, that if something goes wrong, you won't have a headache. They will take it and they will fix it for you. And sometimes it might actually be worth it. Sometimes it's a gimmick. But zakat, it purifies what we have. It is that divine protection plan to make sure that what Allah has given us, it's not going to go bad. It's not going to be something that we are able to enjoy temporarily, and then all of a sudden when we need it most, it doesn't work. Everything has a zakat. Zakatul ilmi nashru. That to have knowledge, the zakat is that you shouldn't be stingy. That only I know this and nobody else knows it, but to spread it. And in hadith we are told that zakatul ajsad as-sawm. The zakat of our bodies, to purify our bodies, to protect our bodies, to make sure that they stay healthy and that we are able to flourish, that is accomplished by fasting. So fasting, obligatory and recommended fasts, is something that is very good. What is the sunnah that we should be especially careful of trying to maintain? In the Sunni school, you will find different ahadith that are mentioned. Many of them are authentic ahadith from the Prophet, but there is a priority which is often not recognized by those who are not from the school of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. So you will find some who say, for example, that it is recommended to fast on the 2 days of the week, on Monday and on Thursday. That is one hadith which is followed by many in the Sunni community. There is also a hadith which says that you should fast 3 days in the month, but then which those 3 days are is not clearly known. Some say that it is the three ayyam, the ayyamul bid, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Some say that it is the first Thursday and then the next 2 Mondays of the month, and there are other opinions. There are some who say that if you want to fast every day, aside from the days when it is forbidden to fast, that is also good. That is known as Sawmud Dahr. That would be not fasting on Eid al-Fitr, not fasting on Eid al-Adha, not fasting on the 3 Ayyam al-Tashriq, and then fasting every other day of the year. Some say that fasting one day and not fasting the next day, that is what is recommended. So there are different ahadith, and it isn't entirely clear how a person should choose one or another and what is best. And this is a challenge which people sometimes did have. They would then make up their own judgment that, well, I think that I can fast this much and so I will do this. The Imams were very clear that the Prophet did used to have different practices during his lifetime with regard to fasting. In one hadith which is reported from our 6th Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu was-salam, he says that كَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ يَصُومُ حَتَّى يُقَالُ لَا يُفْطِرُ. The Prophet used to fast continuously so many days in a row that people would say that he's never going to stop fasting during the day. وَيُفْطِرُ حَتَّى يُقَالُ لَا يَصُومُ. But then sometimes the Prophet would not fast for so long that people would say maybe he's not going to fast again. Maybe that's not something which he is going to do as an act of devotion to Allah anymore. ثُمَّ صَامَ يَوْمًا وَأَفْطَرَ يَوْمًا. Then the Prophet did begin to fast one day and not fast the next day. This is known in a hadith as Sawmu Dawood, the practice of Dawood in his fast. He had a practice for fasting and a practice for prayer. The practice of Dawood for prayer was to sleep for half of the night, to engage in worship for the next 1/3 of the night, and then to sleep for the last 1/6 of the night. So this was the practice that is reported in some hadith of Prophet Dawood with regard to prayer in the night, and his practice with regard to Psalm was to fast one day and then not to fast the next day. This is something the Prophet did practice. And then it is said that after that, ثُمَّ صَامَ الْإِثْنَيْنِ وَالْخَمِيسِ. After that, the Prophet began to fast on Mondays and Thursdays. So those examples that I mentioned, which the general Muslim community does speak about, they are mentioned in this hadith of the Imam. The Prophet did practice them. But the Prophet did so for reasons that we don't perhaps fully understand. Maybe he wanted to give a message to other religious communities that used to fast in a certain way, that this is permissible within Islam. Maybe he wanted to remove any kind of rumors that might spread, that maybe the Prophet doesn't fast because he's not able to fast continuously, or he doesn't want to fast, or he doesn't give it importance. So whatever the reasons may have been, those were temporary stages in the Prophet's practice. The final practice of the Prophet, ثُمَّ آلَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ إِلَىٰ أَنْ يُصَامَ ثَلَاثَةُ أَيَّامٍ مِنْ كُلِّ شَهْرٍ. That after that, the Prophet ended his practice at the end of his life by fasting 3 days of every month. And ذَلِكَ تَمَامُ مَا جَرَتْ بِهِ السُنَّةُ فِي الصَّوْمِ. That is the entirety of what the sunnah is in fasting. 3 days in every month. And for a Muslim, وَذَلِكَ صَوْمُ الدَّهْرِ. That is considered to be fasting continuously. Because if you fast 3 days, Allah multiplies the blessings of it by tenfold at least, and that counts as fasting the entire month. So it is recommended to fast 3 days out of every month. Now it can be any 3 days. For those of us who may have work schedules, school schedules, if weekdays are not easy, then we can fast on the weekends. 3 days out of every lunar Islamic month, though, we should make an effort to fast. And if some of us find it easier to fast on the weekdays, then that is fine. The very best practice, though, is to fast on specific 3 days of the month. That is the first Thursday of the lunar month. So whenever the Islamic month begins, the first Thursday of that month, it might be the first day of the month or any of the days in the next week, whichever the first Thursday is, that is recommended. Then out of the second 10 days of the month, the first Wednesday in the middle 10 days of the month, between 10 and 19, the first Wednesday. And then in the last 10 days of the month, it is one of those Thursdays. The best is to fast the last Thursday. But if you're not sure if you're going to be able to make it. So let's say, for example, that Thursday is the 23rd. Now, it might be that the month will have 30 days, and the last day will be Thursday. It might be that the month will have 29 days, in which case, if you don't fast on the 23rd, what's going to happen? You won't be able to fast on the last Thursday of the month. So the best thing is to fast the last Thursday of the month. But if you're not able to do so, or if you're not sure if you'll make it, or for example, you might be traveling, then it's just as well acceptable to fast on the first Thursday of the last 10 days. So it's خَمِيسَان بَيْنَهُمَا أَرْبِعَةٌ. 2 Thursdays and 1 Wednesday in the middle. Right? The first Thursday, the last Thursday of the month, and then the first Wednesday of the middle 10 days. That is the sunnah of the Prophet that he practiced at the end of his life. That is the sunnah which was emphasized by the imams as being important. To the extent that if you are not able to do so, it is recommended to make it up, to do the qada. Even to the extent of counting how many days you missed and making it up in the winter. So that is a hadith where somebody came to the imam and said that if I'm not able to do so, then what should I do? And the imam replied that if you keep track of how many days you missed, when winter comes, the days are short, then you can make up 3 days for every month in the summer months that you were not able to fast. So it is the sunnah of the Prophet. It's not just something that we can say, well, that's recommended. It's something that we should give some importance to. And then it is also mentioned that if you are not able to fast, either at all or because it's difficult for you, even if it's mashaqqa, possible but hard, then you have the opportunity of atoning for it in one of 2 ways. One is to give a dirham in sadaqah for every day. So every month you can give 3 dirhams in sadaqah. Many of us, we already do make an intention for sadaqah. The equivalent of 1 dirham in sadaqah that can, for each day. So 3 dirhams, that would be the equivalent for fasting those 3 days. And also to give 1 mud of food. So to give that 1.5 pounds of food to a needy person for each of those days, that is also the atonement. So this is the sunnah of the Prophet. It's not excessive. 3 days of the month, 1/10 of our time, is something that all of us should be able to do. And if we're not able to do so, then we can keep track and make it up in the winter. And if we're still not able to do so, we have these 2 ways of making it up. Finally, what is that 1 dirham. I don't think any of us have access to silver coinage. There are different ways that you can calculate. Each dirham is about 3 grams of silver. Silver, however, has lost a lot of its value since the time of the Prophet. So maybe a more accurate estimate of the equivalent monetary value is to use gold. Right? Gold is, 1 dinar is 4 1/4 grams, 4.25 grams. And the value of a dinar, I believe today, if gold is about 1,200 per ounce, correct me if I'm wrong, or so, then that will be approximately $180 or so is 1 dinar. Whenever you hear the mention of 1 dinar, that would be equivalent to about $180. That's going to change, of course, depending on the price of gold. In the time of the Prophet, a dirham was 1/10 of that. So you can imagine that probably a better estimate, rather than converting directly from silver, is to say that 1/10 of the price of a dinar, so approximately $15 to $18, that is probably the equivalent monetary value of a dirham in the time of Imam Ja'far Sadiq when he mentioned this hadith. So if we can make that intention of sadaqah for those of us who are not going to be able to fast, some of us might know already that after the month of Ramadan we're not going to be able to do so, or we might have health reasons or other reasons for not doing so, about $45 to $60 a month in sadaqah, that will give you the thawab of completing the sunnah of the Prophet with fasting. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our fast and our acts of worship. And with that we will conclude today's session and inshallah prepare for Salatul Maghrib. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.